So, in our final unit, of which there's going to be two small projects, we are covering implicit and unconscious bias. And this is going to unfold in a couple ways. So, first, we're going to focus on just implicit bias that leads to racial bias. And then we're going to open it up for your last project where you're able to choose any people group or topic that could come under the purview of unconscious bias. So, just to define it, implicit obviously means like inside. It's the opposite of explicit. So, something that's obvious versus something that's not obvious. And we know what bias is, preferences towards things. And we can have preferences that we're aware of me preferring ramen over any other food group. But we also have unconscious biases that are dictated not by our actual like conscious preferences, but a lot of times based on our upbringing and the kinds of media that we've consumed. So to break this down of how it works, when we see somebody, we instantly classify them. And we're going to look into more of the science of this in the next part of this unit. So we're going to first just sort of deal broadly with the idea of stereotypes, because obviously anytime that we identify somebody, we're collecting data about them, and our brain takes that data and tries to figure out, what are you? We've been doing that since we were younger. And so when we read some chapters of Blind Spot in a couple weeks, this is going to make a lot more sense of cognitively, what is our brain doing when we look at somebody and we classify them, because it's really good for us to do that. It's how we learn at a young age who we can trust and who we don't trust. Of course, that also can get us into trouble. But like we're taught when we're younger, if we're lost, to go to somebody in a uniform. That's obviously questionable now, but we look for those identifiers of a uniform, of a badge, of some sort of official security component, and we know this is the person that I can go to. It also just helps us recognize who is our friends or our family and who's not. And this is very tribal, obviously, too. If you think about our societies way back in the day, people lived only with their tribe, whatever that may be around the world. And if they saw somebody who didn't look like them, it could be threatening to them. And so all of that is still hardwired in our brain. So when we look at somebody, we soak in the stuff that we can ascertain, and then we process that data and we search for anything else that happens to be in that same folder. So I like to think of us as having lots of different file folders, like the desktop of your laptop or your home computer. And in it, we store any kind of information that we gather about, let's say, Asian. And you can see where I'm going with this. All of those things are very stereotypical, good at math and sciences, musical, Asian food. I'm not saying that's stereotypical, but that is sort of where we assign cultures by food, ninja movies, and none of those are explicitly wrong, but obviously they're incomplete. So if this is what someone's brain pulls up, there's a lot of other stuff that they're not understanding, maybe even about this particular person, this particular Asian middle-aged man or Asian American middle-aged man. And so you can kind of guess how it's going to go wrong. But some of our folders have a lot of stuff in them. Some of them do not. And it's all based off of our experiences. So these folders are called schemas. And those are those mental folders for information. And the more that we experience, the bigger those folders become. So somebody who's, lived in several other countries is going to just have more in that schema folder about a certain cuisine or a certain people group than somebody who is not, just because you've had those experiences. And you're less likely to just pull out these stereotypical things because you've seen, for example, Asian. Maybe even that schema is like, oh, okay, I can look at this person and he's clearly Korean. And then these change. They're not broadly Asian. You have very Korean elements that are within that schema, the more detailed that they become. And so these are neutral. They're not good or bad. We actually really need these schemas because they're activated automatically, and we are not aware of pulling stuff out of schemas. It just happens instantaneously. So I think I've used this example in class with the door, but an example of why we need these schemas is, let's say that every time you approached a chair, you had to relearn that chair and figure out, like, is this a chair? Like, how do I sit on this? Where do I put my body? Is this a safe place for me to sit? But thankfully, even though all three of these chairs, for example, look very different, have different surfaces, maybe in different contexts, our body instinctively knows what to do because it looks at this and it's like, cool, chair, I know what to do. And so that same kind of schema system can make us automatically think, oh, Asian, I know this. I know this guy. I get what he's about, whether or not we're conscious of that in the first place. And that, of course, leads to, I mean, it's not immediate, but it can lead to racism, which is another thing we'll talk about. If there's a difference between having unconscious bias towards somebody of a certain race and actually acting on those. So you are not racist just because you have those unconscious biases. Racism is more about how it then affects your actions and your thinking about that person. But it's a fine line, and we'll spend more time talking about that. And I'm very curious to hear how you guys define that line too. So let's say, looking at me, I'm young, white, female. By the way I dress, in the context that I'm in, I appear, I believe, middle class. And so there are schemas for this, and all of you guys can sort of make your little hashtags of, like, what do people see when they see me? What schemas are they searching through in their brain? And I've already talked about some of the bias that happens within academia of me being small and younger, and everyone thinking I'm a student, and even when they don't, perhaps not validating my opinion as much, not because they're being sexist. It's just, yeah, we live in a society that doesn't value youth. Like, you guys have been discriminated against for being young. I'm sure that at some point there are ideas that you had that weren't taken seriously simply because you're younger. So somebody can look at this, and some of the basic stereotypes are, oh, she, wants to be married, women in their 30s or late 20s. That's sort of what's on their mind, or baby fever. And then neither of those things are true for me, or being very emotional. And whether or not you're conscious of that, that's what you're thinking. And then you behave that way towards that individual who may be me. I think women get it with the emotional thing a lot, or definitely for babies, for me, asking, so when are you going to have a kid? Not if I want one, but when. And then what are you going to do with teaching? Are you going to, like, what are you going to do with your career? It's like, I'm still going to have it if for some reason that happens. And that kind of question doesn't come up with men very much at all. I know I'm veering into gender here, and we'll have some time. So these kind of biases come from our in-grouping and out-grouping, which are terms we'll use a lot. We're all a part of certain in-groups. You could think back to when we talked about subcultures. You are an in-group there, and there's just things that people who are not in your in-group don't understand. And a lot of these biases come from either cultural experiences, so culturally we're taught something about somebody else, or it can come from individual positive or negative experiences. So I think a great example is the typical American veteran, let's say World War II style, or Korean War. So there's a reason that there are so many racist grandpas out there, or great grandpas, especially those who are white, because those who fought in, let's say, Vietnam or in Korea or in Japan, they had a generally bad experience because that person was, quote unquote, the enemy. And that doesn't just go away. That colors the way that you see it from then on. I know people's grandparents who refuse to eat any kind of, quote unquote, Asian food because it's sort of this enemy food. And that makes no logical sense, but that gets really fixed in you. And even if you explain all the evidence of, like, look, none of that makes sense. The war's been a while. Eating this food does not mean that you are consuming the food of the enemy. They're also Americans now. It doesn't matter because that experience is so trenchant in their psyche. So explicit bias is easier because we can check in with ourselves. We're able to, again, express that bias or preference. And a lot of times we'll discover our implicit bias surprisingly. It will slip out. I certainly experienced this. I don't remember if I've told you, but my partner, Zach, is Mexican-American, and he'll catch things that I say that I didn't realize were assumptive or reductive of him being Latino. And I teach critical race theory, and I think I'm pretty woke. But it's really good. I'm like, holy shit. I had no idea that there was this sort of implied hierarchy in what I was saying, or even assuming something about him. Like I assumed when we started dating that he celebrated Dia de los Muertos, and I was really excited about that. And like that was a good learning experience for me as a white person being in a multiracial relationship. So that's easy. The implicit bias, you have no access to it. It's very hard to identify that you have it. And so, really, the only way to do it is to be really critical of yourself and to be aware of what biases are. That is really the only way to diagnose and to almost retrain yourself. And these don't go away. You'll never get rid of certain preferences that you have. And a little bit later, we'll take the AIT, the implicit association test, that does reveal your biases. And I have, as a female, I still have preference male. Because I live in a society that's patriarchal. And so when I take these tests, I think that being a strong feminist and aggressively liberal is going to change my results, and it doesn't. Or same with weight bias or racial bias. My friends of color have taken the IAT, and they end up having a white bias. Even though they themselves are of color, because we live in a society that has already created a hierarchy that's so ingrained in the way that we see power disseminated. So some of these biases, it doesn't all have to do with just people. A lot of them are just exposures in a particular context. I put the Steve Irwin up there because animals that we're afraid of, we have to learn to be afraid of them. So the more nature shows we watched as a kid and we see snakes being framed as dangerous or biting, whatever, we're going to think of them as dangerous. I've watched this with my neighbor who now she's older, but when she was about, I don't know, 2, she loved bugs. She thought they were so rad. She loved spiders. She had a spider stuffed animal. And then she started watching a new kids cartoon. And on that cartoon, every time that a bug would show up or a spider showed up, all the kids in the show would go eek, and they'd run away and be scared. And so her mom started to notice that she also would respond, not sincerely, but whenever she'd see a bug in a book, and she had many bug books, she would go, eek, scary. But you could tell she wasn't afraid. It's just that learned behavior that gets ingrained. I can't remember if we had a stupid rule question about comfort food. What is your comfort food? But that's very based on a particular context. What you see as comfort food is what you were comforted with as a kid. So I have 2 best friends. One's Pakistani and one is Armenian. And their comfort food is lentil soups and hummus and basmati rice with certain sauces. And for me, I grew up with a mom who was Norwegian, Midwestern, and so it was always just potatoes and mashed potatoes and carbs and stuff like that. Processed foods. So what we go to has already been pre-established for us, and so we can think about that same thing as working with larger ideologies and preferences towards people groups too. Obviously, you can see where this is going. When we start acting on those, it ends up being super problematic. So I think we've most likely heard of both of these. Those of you who reviewed or wrote your last paper on the campus rape article that I cannot remember what it's called, it brought up Brock Turner, I believe. So on the left, we have Brock Turner, who was caught raping an unconscious woman at a party, had witnesses, and Trayvon Martin, who was innocent and murdered, coming back from a convenience store with, I think it was Skittles, I can't remember, and he was shot because he was wearing a hoodie. So obviously we can see how this was a horrible, horrific, tragic example of bias, of looking at this boy and seeing dangerous or thug or gangster because he had a hood up. But I want to pay attention to these 2 photos because these were the photos that were shown on the news in the first couple shots or first couple days of reporting on these stories. There's a big difference between these. So Brock Turner, they used a school photo. He's smiling. He's wearing a tie. He looks very professional. Whereas the photo they chose of Trayvon Martin, he's leaning down at you. He looks a little I don't know, very serious. He has his hoodie on, very dark eyes. He's not smiling. It's not professionally taken. So these really impact how people then think about the story. A lot of people came out and said, oh, he's just, I mean, even the judge said, like, he's just a good boy. He made a mistake. You know, look at his GPA, look at his water polo record. Whereas none of that was ever used for Trayvon Martin, even though he was the victim, and Brock Turner was the aggressor. So something as simple as the photo that you choose in a news story can be tremendously impactful in how you want people to respond to you. Another horrible example was, I think this was her name, Naya. I can't remember. 2 years ago, a homeless man who seemed to have some mental illness slash the neck of Naya. Naya? This is going to bother me. And outside of a BART station in Oakland. And this was the photo that KTVU showed on the news. And this is of the girl who was murdered. This is a phone case that looks like a gun. And they went on her Instagram and they showed, or Facebook, I can't remember, and chose these photos, not the ones of her with her family, not of her as a cheerleader, not of her with her friends, not a cute selfie, not a school photo. They chose this one, which wasn't even her profile pic, to show on the news. It's important that she's Black. It's important that this is in Oakland. It's important that there is incredible racial divides within Oakland of gentrification and of the Black community. Obviously, people were pissed. Again, not a gun, it's a cell phone case. But it does portray her as being violent, and it could make people think, as it did, oh, it was probably a gang-related activity, or oh, she was probably doing something wrong, or oh, maybe she was, he was trying to buy drugs off of her. And that's what people were saying just because of this photo being shown. I forget why I put this in here. I'll come back to it if I remember. So I love this video that was produced a while ago. Oh, pause. Just of how these little differences, a photo or a name, can impact how somebody treats you. Obviously, you can see that I am watching a lot of Bon Appetit videos. Learn how to make things. Okay.
My name's Jose Zamora, and I had to drop a letter to get the title. Every morning I wake up, go on Craigslist, and apply to as many jobs, every job that I feel qualified for. About 50 to 100 a day for months. No phone calls, no emails, nothing. One day I just thought, what if I try Joe? Just remove the S in my name and maybe I can make some dollar signs. The Monday I decided to go from Jose to Joe. 7 days later, the next Monday, that's when all the responses started coming. That's when all the replies and the emails. The position is open, we want to meet with you. Call us back. I was applying for the same exact jobs, the exact same resume, the exact same experience, just a different name. Sometimes I don't even think people know or conscious or aware that they're judging, even if it's by a name, but I think we all do it all the time.
Okay. So I like that one, especially because he was applying to the exact same jobs. Do I think that the people reading the resumes were racist? I honestly think everybody's racist. I'm racist. Everybody's a little bit racist. And the sooner that we accept that, the sooner we can just move on and figure out how to make things more egalitarian for all of us and equitable. But no, I don't think that they were actively looking at his resume and saying, oh, no, Jose, I don't want a Latino to be working here. No. I do not think that that's true, especially if this is in LA. But that is really great evidence of how unconsciously you could associate really, really negative stereotypes that people have of Latinos, for example. One of the predominant ones that is one of the most destructive is laziness. And by the way, we can acknowledge that certain stereotypes exist without saying that we agree with them. We're going to have to get comfortable with saying like, oh, a stereotype of this kind of person is this. We, again, are not espousing it as true. But that person could see Jose and then have all of those associations that are packed into their schema, whether or not they realize it or not.